What if the life you're trying so hard to hold together is the very thing that's keeping you from who you really are? We don't always build a false life because we're evil or confused. Sometimes we build it because we're frightened. Because somewhere early on, we learned that who we really are was just too much, or maybe not enough, or too soft, or too strange, or too sensitive, or too needy, or too intense, or too honest, or too alive. And so we made an adjustment, and then another adjustment, and another one, and we became more acceptable and more functional, more palatable and more strategic, more pleasing, but more armored. And eventually, without even noticing the exact moment that it happened, we stopped living from our center and we began living from a construction, as if somebody else was there building a house right inside of us. We become a version of ourselves that we can assemble in order to survive. And survival can be pretty convincing. I mean, you can build an entire world from a distortion and make it look beautiful on the outside. You could choose relationships from it and careers from it and beliefs from it and routines from it. And you could even become admired for it, desired for it, rewarded for it. And people can call it maturity and success and stability and discipline. And they can point to what you've built and say, wow, look how far you've come. But deep inside, something does not rest, because the soul knows. The soul knows when it's being represented by a counterfeit, even a sophisticated one. It knows when your smile is loyal to an old wound, and it knows when your ambition is really just fear, all dressed up in expensive clothing. And it knows when your goodness is a performance, and when your strength is a refusal to feel, and when your belonging has been purchased through your own self-betrayal. And it knows when you're living in a house that was built by someone who abandoned you a long time ago and then called that abandonment your identity. So what happens when you wake up? What happens when after years of effort you finally or suddenly see that the life that you built was built from a false premise? And that the foundation was never the truth, but it was some adaptation of what was expected of you. That you were never building a life for your real self. You were building it for the self that you invented in order to be loved, to be safe, to be chosen. And it's devastating. Because awakening is not only some illumination, it's also a demolition. And the tragedy is not merely that you were living falsely. The tragedy is that you may have been living falsely with sincerity. And you may have tried really hard, and you may have given your whole heart to a life that was never really yours. And you may have mistaken endurance for alignment and numbness for peace and admiration for love. And when truth begins to break through, it does not politely suggest change. No, it exposes, it burns, it ruins the old language, and it makes your former life feel uninhabitable. And you start to see that what once looked stable was actually organized around a big fat lie. And then comes in the impossible choice. Well, are you going to remain loyal to the life that you built from distortion? Or are you going to become loyal to the truth of who you are? And that choice feels like death, because in a way it is. To return to the truth of who you are, it often requires the destruction of what the falsehood made. And it's not because destruction is so glamorous. No, it's not. But because what is built on self-betrayal and self-abandonment cannot become a sanctuary. You cannot keep living inside of a structure designed to contain your disappearance and then call that freedom. At some point, the life built from these false selves become a prison for the real self. And so yes, sometimes to reign in the truth of who you really are, you're going to have to blow up the life that you created when you did not yet know yourself. You have to let certain relationships end because they were only possible when you were pretending. And you have to leave rooms where your distortion was welcomed more than your reality. And you have to disappoint the people who only know how to love your mask. And you have to surrender identities that you worked years to protect. You have to grieve the time lost and the choices that you made and the self you abandoned, the altars that you built to a version of you that never deserved that much devotion. And that's the part that people do not talk about enough. That awakening does not just give you the truth, it also gives you consequences. Because once you see clearly what has happened to you, you cannot unsee it. And once you know the life is false, staying in it becomes a form of violence against the self. And what used to feel normal begins to feel unbearable. And what used to feel responsible begins to feel like nothing but compliance. And what used to feel like love begins to feel like participation in your own erasure. And yet, even in the grief, there is something holy in that collapse. Because the destruction is not meaningless. It's not reckless. It's not failure. In fact, in my opinion, I believe it's inevitable. And it's that moment in your life where everything stops being organized around who you had become and it begins to finally make room for who you are. And that process is brutal. Because truth asks for everything false to lose its authority over you. And it asks you to stop calling survival your identity. And it asks you to stop protecting systems that were built to keep you disconnected from yourself. And it asks you to trust that the ruin of a false life is not the ruin of your life. It's the beginning of an honest one. And honesty can feel like a disaster before it feels like freedom. There's a season, an awakening, where nothing fits and that old self is dying. But the true self is still fragile. It's unnamed. It's still emerging. And you're no longer willing to live that old lie, but you don't yet know how to fully live the truth. And that in-between space is excruciating. And it can make you feel insane and selfish and faithless and ungrateful. But often that's simply what rebirth feels like when it's viewed from the perspective of the collapsing false self. And the life that you're losing may have been functional. And it may have been pretty impressive. But if it required your distortion, then it was costing you your life force energy every day. And there comes a moment when the cost becomes too high. So the awakening begins. And it's not a clean revelation, but it's a slow intolerability. It's like a crack in your performance, or a grief with no obvious source, or a rage that finally tells the truth and blurts it out, or it's an exhaustion that cannot be solved by any level of rest. It's a longing that will not shut up anymore. And the real self that's been buried under years of strategy and fear begins knocking from the underneath the floorboards of your structure that your false self built. And eventually you understand that this is not a breakdown because you're weak. No. No, this is a breakdown because something true in you has refused to die. And that truth is worth losing things for. It's worth losing approval for. It's worth losing certainty for. And it's worth losing roles and structures and narratives and all of your stories and your borrowed dreams for. Because there's no real peace in succeeding as somebody you're not. There's no real safety in being loved for your performance. And there's no real life in protecting a false self so well that the true self never gets to breathe. And so when a person wakes up and realizes that they've built their life on distortion, the task is not to decorate that distortion better. And it's not to make the prison more comfortable. It's to tell the truth and to start the grieving and to dismantle and to walk into that fire of your own becoming, to let that false architecture fall, even when it falls loudly and even when others call it destruction and even when the world misunderstands. Because sometimes what looks like your life falling apart is actually your life refusing to remain built on a lie. And sometimes the most loving thing that you can do for yourself is to stop protecting that version of you that was created in pain. So blow it up if you must. Blow up that life that demanded your distortion. Blow up the identity that required your disappearance. Blow up the allegiance to fear and performance and inherited fiction. And not because you're careless with your life, but because you're finally reverent toward your truth. And what comes after is not going to be easy, but it's going to be real. And a real life, even if it's a little bit smaller than the first, and even if it's a little bit quieter, and even if it's built with your trembling hands from the wreckage of everything false, it is worth more than any grand life that's built on self-abandonment. Because at last, it's going to be yours. And at last, it's going to be real. And at last, it will be built on the truth of who you are and who you've come here to be. So if you're at that point where you cannot keep performing your life, where the mask is breaking and that old story is dying and you know there's no going back now, don't try to white knuckle your way through it alone. This is the kind of threshold that changes everything for you. And if you're in it and you're ready to stop living a lie and start rebuilding from something real, this is the work that I do. I invite you to come work with me.